Are you going to do the interview with me, or do you want to watch?
I'll do it with you.
Oh, you want to do it with me?
Well done.
Okay.
Eric, will you help me grill your daddy? Should we ask him some questions?
Picture the man the world spent 2 decades watching on television. Sharp, controlled, unmoved by tears, unimpressed by sob stories, and entirely unbothered by the fact that millions of people thought he was cold. That was Simon Cowell's brand, and for a long time, it worked perfectly. Then something shifted. People started noticing it in the way he spoke, in the way he listened, in the pauses that came before his words. And almost immediately, the internet decided it had an explanation. Stories began circulating online, dramatic thumbnails, emotional music, claims about a hidden diagnosis involving his young son Eric. The algorithm picked it up, pushed it further, and within days, what began as whispers had turned into something millions of people accepted as truth. But here's where things get complicated. Because when you move past the viral noise and look at what actually happened, the real story is far more layered, far more human, and far more powerful than any clickbait headline could ever capture. Let us start with what the internet got wrong, because that part matters. There is no verified, credible reporting that Simon Cowell's son Eric has any chronic illness or rare diagnosis. As fact-checkers and entertainment journalists have confirmed, the claims circulating across social media trace back to unreliable sources, viral posts, clickbait videos, and websites that cite no medical statements, no family representatives, and no real interviews. What is confirmed is straightforward. Eric Cowell was born on Valentine's Day in 2014. He is the son of Simon and his now fiancée Lauren Silverman, and by all credible accounts, he is an active, energetic, and healthy young boy. In fact, Simon himself was seen with Eric at the America's Got Talent Season 19 quarterfinals in September 2024, and the family has been photographed regularly at public events looking every bit like a close, happy unit. The heartbreaking diagnosis the internet latched onto, it was never officially about Eric. An understanding that changes everything about how we read Simon Cowell's transformation. So if Eric is not ill, then why did Simon change so visibly? Why did a man who once built an entire television career on ruthless honesty begin showing up to auditions with softer eyes, longer pauses, and what looked unmistakably like genuine emotion? The answer begins not with Eric, but with Simon himself, and with a period of his life that rarely gets discussed in full. After losing his father in 1999 and then his mother in 2015, Simon fell into what he has openly described as a downward spiral. On Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast, he spoke with rare vulnerability about that period, saying that he had reached a point where nothing mattered, that he felt like a clown on television because he was dying inside, and that the loss of both parents left him feeling a finality that no amount of professional success could soften. He gained weight. He worked obsessively. He described himself as staying up until 7 or 8 in the morning, becoming, in his own words, a ridiculous workaholic. The sharp judge the world saw on screen was, behind closed doors, a man running on empty. Then came the news that he was going to be a father. And according to Simon, that changed everything. He has spoken about the moment he saw the scan of his unborn son with a kind of wonder that catches you off guard coming from someone with his reputation. He told People magazine that Eric essentially saved him, that the love he felt for his son came back 100 times more powerful than anything he had experienced before. He began enforcing strict personal rules about rest. He stopped believing that working through exhaustion produced good results. He became, for the first time in decades, someone who went home at the end of the day and meant it. You realize that there are other things more important actually than your career, he said simply, in an interview that reflected how completely his priorities had rearranged themselves. The workaholic who once chased ratings through the night became a father who chased something else entirely: time. But fatherhood was only one part of what cracked him open. There were other moments, real and documented ones, that the internet stumbled across and then misread. One of the most significant came during the run of Britain's Got Talent, when a 15-year-old dancer named Julia Carlisle performed with her group, Mersey Girls. Julia had been diagnosed with scoliosis, a serious curvature of the spine that was causing a severe pain and threatening her ability to dance at all. The performance itself was remarkable, but what happened afterward was what revealed something new about Simon Cowell. He approached Julia and her group backstage and told her, quietly and directly, that he would personally fund her spinal surgery. The procedure, A specialized vertebral body tethering operation performed in the United States cost £175,000. Simon paid it without fanfare, without a press release, and without turning it into a television moment. Julia later recalled that she could not believe it. "He didn't have to do it," she said, "and he has changed my life." That act of generosity was not the behavior of a man performing kindness for the cameras. It was a behavior of someone who had been genuinely moved and who had the means to do something about it. What the internet saw in the aftermath of moments like these was a man who looked different on screen. More thoughtful, less quick to interrupt, more willing to sit with something uncomfortable before speaking. And because the internet rarely accepts a quiet explanation, it constructed a louder one, a secret illness, a hidden crisis, a diagnosis that explained the change. The reality is both simpler and more profound. When you become a father later in life, as Simon did at 54, you do not just gain a child. You gain an entirely new way of seeing the world. Every young person on that stage starts to look different. Every story of struggle carries a new weight. Simon has said himself that he looks at contestants differently now, that when he sees someone young fighting through something difficult, it lands in a place it never reached before. The distance that once defined his judging style had collapsed, and fatherhood was a reason. Then came the physical wake-up call that forced even deeper change. In August 2020, Simon fell from an electric bike at his home in Malibu and broke his back in several places. It was a serious injury, serious enough to require major surgery and months of recovery. He missed the entire season of America's Got Talent. And according to those close to him, it was during that recovery that Eric became his driving force in a way that went beyond inspiration into something closer to necessity. His longtime friend and singer-songwriter told The Sun that Simon would look at Eric and think, "I've got to get through this somehow." He made a full recovery, and when he came back, he did so with a different relationship to his own body and his own limitations. The man who had once stayed awake until the early hours running on willpower alone had learned, painfully and literally, that the body does not negotiate. You either listen to it, or eventually it stops the conversation itself. The lifestyle changes that followed were genuine and sustained. Simon adopted a healthier diet, increased his physical activity, and began structuring his days around being present rather than being productive at all costs. He told a publication in 2022 that keeping up with Eric on the football pitch was reason enough to stay fit, joking that his son's energy was off the chart. He also spoke about Eric holding him accountable in other areas, catching him if he tried to sneak a cigarette, acting, as Simon put it, like a strict teacher. There is something quietly remarkable in that image. The most famously harsh judge in television history, being held to a higher standard by his own child. But that is exactly what happened. Eric did not just give Simon a reason to live differently. He gave Simon a mirror, a reflection that made it impossible to keep living the old way without feeling the cost of it. And that reflection is what people were really seeing when they watched Simon on screen and felt something had changed. The tears that surprised viewers during golden buzzer moments, the longer pauses before difficult feedback, the way he leaned forward when a contestant shared a painful story, none of that was performance. It was a man who had genuinely widened his capacity to feel. He had lost both parents. He had faced his own mortality on a Malibu driveway. He had funded a teenager's surgery in a corridor backstage. He had held a son who, in his own words, saved him from a point in his life when nothing mattered. By the time audiences noticed the change, it had already been years in the making. The irony at the heart of this story is that the internet was not entirely wrong to sense that something had happened. Something had. Something significant enough to rewrite how Simon Cowell showed up in the world. But the instinct to locate that change in a hidden tragedy involving his son reflects how we often misread transformation in public figures. We look for the dramatic event, the secret crisis, the diagnosis that explains everything. What we are less comfortable with is the slow, accumulating weight of real life, grief, injury, love, fear, and the steady pressure of fatherhood on someone who never expected to feel it this deeply. Those things do not make for a shocking thumbnail, but they make for a genuine human story. There is another layer to this story that rarely gets examined, and it has to do with fear. Not the fear of failure, which Simon has always navigated comfortably, but a quieter and far more personal fear, the fear of loss. He has spoken about becoming a patron for Together for Short Lives, a charity that supports children with life-threatening conditions, and about how fatherhood deepened his understanding of what it means to face that kind of reality. He has said publicly that now that he is a father, he understands on a much deeper level how devastating it would be to hear the news that your child was unwell. Those words were not spoken in the context of any diagnosis involving Eric. They were spoken as a reflection on what love actually costs once it arrives. Because when you love someone that completely, especially a child, you carry the awareness of everything that could go wrong. And Simon carried that awareness onto every stage, into every audition room, and in front of every young contestant who stepped forward with a difficult story. He was no longer watching from behind glass. He was standing on the same side as the emotion, feeling the full weight of it. Consider what that means for someone whose entire public identity was built on the opposite posture. For more than 2 decades, Simon Cowell's value to television was his apparent immunity to sentiment. While other judges wiped tears and offered encouragement, he delivered verdicts. He was a standard that cut through the noise, and audiences loved him for it, or at least loved watching him, which amounts to the same thing in the entertainment business. That image was not entirely false. It was real, and it was built over decades of working in an industry where decisiveness matters and sentiment can cloud judgment. But it was also, as Simon has now admitted, a kind of armor. The man behind the armor was someone who felt things deeply, who was shattered by his father's death, who worked obsessively as a way of avoiding the grief, who eventually admitted that being on television during his darkest period felt like wearing a costume while falling apart underneath it. What Eric did was not give Simon new feelings. What Eric did was give him a reason to stop running from the ones he already had. And that distinction matters enormously, because people who transform dramatically in public life are often described as if they discovered something entirely new about themselves. The reality is usually more honest than that. They stopped hiding what was always there. Simon Cowell was always capable of the empathy people now see on screen. He was always capable of generosity, the kind that shows up quietly in a backstage corridor and offers to pay for a teenager's surgery without a camera pointed at it. He was always capable of the kind of love that completely reorganizes a person's priorities. What he lacked, for most of his adult life, was a particular catalyst that would make him stop pretending otherwise. Fatherhood was that catalyst, and it arrived late enough in his life that he could feel the full force of contrast. He knew who he had been. He knew what he had prioritized. He knew how many mornings he had watched the sun come up from a desk rather than from a window with his family beside him. And then, suddenly, he was watching his son play football in the English countryside and thinking about how to stay fit enough to keep up. He was being lectured about cigarettes by a boy who had not yet reached his teens. He was sitting in a judge's chair on national television and finding himself genuinely moved by a child on stage who reminded him, without words, of everything he stood to lose. None of that arrived without cost. The back injury, the grief, the years of working himself into exhaustion, those were real prices paid for a life lived at full throttle with no consideration for what it was doing quietly beneath the surface. Simon Cowell today is still Simon Cowell. He still produces television. He still shapes the entertainment industry. He launched a new Netflix competition series, The Next Act, and he remains someone capable of the directness that made him famous. But the version of him that exists now is one that has said, clearly and on the record, that Eric is the most important thing that ever happened to him, that he would swap all his success to have had more time with his own father, that fatherhood pulled him out of a darkness he was not sure he could find his way out of. These are not the words of a man hiding a secret. They are the words of a man who finally stopped hiding from himself. The goodbye that people sensed was real. It just was not the goodbye they imagined. It was a goodbye to the version of Simon Cowell who believed that nothing mattered more than work, who stayed awake chasing perfection until the early hours of the morning, who kept the world at a careful emotional distance because vulnerability felt like weakness. That version of him is gone. And in his place is something the world is still learning to read. A man who openly says his son saved his life, who funds a young dancer's surgery in a corridor backstage and never brings it up again, who tears up at a golden buzzer and does not apologize for it. Not because his son is ill, but because becoming a father taught him, at last, what it actually costs to love someone. And once you understand that, nothing looks quite the same ever again.